Friends, welcome, and as we navigate through these times on this 14th Sunday in Ordinary Time, the readings come perfectly hitting us to a very profound message for life, which is as to how you and I take proper care to rest, not just in the physical sense of the word to go to bed, but how do we live our lives in a way that our hearts are at rest. There was once a man who wanted to be away from all his work, commitments and schedules, takes his car to go on a long drive. So he goes through the national parks and wherever there was some place that he could rest, and he stops at one place, just goes to relax for 2 hours before he begins to drive again. As he gets himself to rest mode, someone knocks on his glass window of the car and says, "Hello sir, what's the time now?" He looks at his clock and says, "It's 8:15 a.m. After that, he goes back to rest again, trying to sleep for some time before he drives. 15 minutes later, another man comes and knocks on the window and says, "Sir, may I know what the time is right now?" He says, 8:30 a.m. Then he thought for a while, if I'm like this, I think people come and keep disturbing me all the time. He gets up, writes on a piece of paper with big letters, "I don't know the time." After 15 minutes, another man happens to pass that way and knocks on the door and says, "Sir, now it is 8:45 a.m. He wanted to rest, really rest, but he could not. The readings today give us this indication, but with a profound lesson for our spiritual life. The first reading from the prophet Zechariah. This reading already has some Advent themes. Only 2 verses for the first reading today. These 2 verses constitute a rich oracle pronouncement of salvation. 2 things: rejoice greatly and shout for joy. This is the theme and the context of readings we listen to during Advent. Daughter of Jerusalem, rejoice, O daughter of Jerusalem, shout for joy. Now, why it is called the daughter of Jerusalem, not a son of Jerusalem? The ancient city walls were characterized as female. Like a woman who carries her child in the womb, the walls are characterized as female, as a kind of giving an impression or imagery to protect the city. Now, this kingdom that Zechariah is talking about, he is seeing the ideal kingdom, a peaceful kingdom, and he has a vision for the future. In God's time, the future he talks about is, in God's time, the future is already present. In God's time, the future is already present, and that is what he envisions. And now the king that Zechariah talks about is not only the king for the tribe of Israel, but for the entire world. Notice the last sentence of the text. His dominion shall be from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. So the vision that this king has is not just limited to the Israelites, but to the entire world. But this king has 3 peculiar characteristics. What are those? The king is just. In Hebrew means Sadiq. The king is saved by God. In Hebrew means Nosa. The king is also meek. In Hebrew, Ani. Now that meek aspect of it will be replicated in the gospel reading of today. In the second reading, Paul is contrasting 2 ways of living. Basically, living in the flesh and living in the spirit. In Greek, soma, which is my body, pneuma, which is the spirit. So he tries to show to the Romans how they are called to live in the pneuma, in the spirit of Christ. Flesh refers to all forms of life which are inclined away from God. you take a detour away from God. Living in the flesh. Living in the Spirit refers to life in the Spirit, attuned to God, tuning my ears, tuning my heart to God's promptings. That is what Paul says, living in the Spirit. Now he further goes and relates that to the resurrection of Christ. The same Spirit of God that raised Jesus from the dead is dwelling in you. Therefore, we are called to live like the people who live with pneuma, God's Spirit. Before Jesus came, we were all in the flesh. We were in sin. Life in flesh, Paul says, cannot please God. The Spirit of God that raised Jesus from the dead is dwelling within us, and which is making us cry, Abba, Father. You see, that relationship is built when you and I are living in the Spirit. The pneuma, the same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead, is dwelling in me, dwelling in us, and making us to promptly say, cry out, Abba, Father. Living in the Spirit. Living in the Spirit entails means to live humble, as the king characterized by Zechariah in the first reading tells us. In the gospel reading, the first part of the gospel, Jesus condemns the intellectual pride, which is contrary to humility, which is contrary in being humble. Now, the gospel text has three parts basically. The first part is a hymn of thanksgiving. You see the text. At that time, Jesus exclaimed, I give praise to you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth. A hymn of thanksgiving. Part 2, a Christological statement. You see, no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and to anyone to whom the Son wishes to reveal him. A Christological foundation. And 3, an invitation to appeal, where Jesus says, come to me, all you who are burdened. You need rest. Take my yoke upon you, for it is light. For my burden is light and my yoke is easy. Now Jesus addresses the Father as Abba. The hidden things of God are not revealed to the worldly wise people, but they are revealed to those who are humble, to those without pride. Jesus invites us to take his yoke, accept responsibility, which means to live in the Spirit that Paul is talking about in the second reading. To live in the pneuma. When we take the yoke of Jesus upon us, accepting the responsibility, what happens? We live in the Spirit. We truly find that rest. What a perfect weekend for us to listen to these words from Jesus himself. The 4th of July weekend. At this point of time in history where the entire world and our own nation is battling with COVID-19, Jesus tells us, come to me. I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Learn to live in the Spirit and you will find rest for yourselves. Now, in all these three readings, from Zechariah to Paul writing to Romans, and Jesus' own invitation to appeal to go to him and find that rest, the overriding disposition in all these three readings is humility. Jesus, the human manifestation of divine, is meek and humble. Notice how he says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am meek and humble. Like the king who is characterized as Ani in Hebrew, which means meek. We go to Jesus. In going to him, in seeing him as the humble and meek king, we learn to live in the Spirit as humble disciples. True disciple is humble and therefore gives grateful praise to God like Jesus did. I give praise to you, Father, because all that I have, all that I am, all that we are as a nation celebrating the 4th of July, coming from you. Take the burden that we are carrying. We find ourselves restless. Give us the true rest where we can begin to live in the Spirit, not as per the worldly standards in the flesh, but truly living in the Spirit. I think this weekend, we all need to find that rest which only Jesus can give us. For He is humble and meek. His yoke is easy and His burden is light. St. Anthony the Hermit had this experience. Once he was relaxing with his disciples, a hunter happens to pass that way and he sees St. Anthony the Hermit having a kind of jolly time, a relaxing time, and says to St. Anthony the Hermit, "This is not how a monk should live. And I'm quite disappointed with the way you are spending your time relaxing with your disciples." St. Anthony told him, "You are a hunter, aren't you? I want you to do this. Take your bow and arrows. Start shooting the arrows." He does once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, and St. Anthony tells him constantly, one after the other, shoot the next arrow, shoot the next arrow. Finally, the hunter says, "If I go on shooting the arrows, my bow will eventually break." Then St. Anthony Hermit said, "In the same way, I need some time to relax. I need some time to leave myself and leave everything into God's hands. Live in the Spirit." Today, this weekend, let us learn as a nation, as a parish community, as a family, let us find our rest in God, that relaxation in God. As individuals, as families, as parish communities, as a city, as a nation, as an archdiocese, let us find the true rest in Jesus the Christ, the meek and humble King, who can lead us to that avenues of rest, who can help us to live in the Spirit, the pneuma. Friends, please follow us on our social media platforms. Please visit our parish web pages, and please stay home, stay safe, and find that rest in Jesus, our Savior. Father Praveen Lakkisetti, thank you and God bless, and wish you all a happy 4th of July weekend.